Welcome, everyone, to History Behind the Headlines, Government Shutdowns, and the Federal Budget. I'm Sarah Weichsel. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association, and I'm so glad that you are joining us this afternoon. This event is part of History Behind the Headlines, which is a series that brings together leading scholars to discuss the historical context for issues today. In today's session, we'll be discussing U.S. government shutdowns, which have become a staple of the federal budget process during the past few decades. Our panelists will talk about the history of federal appropriations, why shutdowns have become so common, and their broader historical implications. Today's discussion will be moderated by Kathryn Cramer Brownell, professor of history at Purdue University. Dr. Brownell's research and teaching focus on the relationships between media, politics, and popular culture, with an emphasis on the American presidency. Her most recent book, 24/7 Politics, Cable Television and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News, explores the political battle over cable television from the 1960s through today, excavating how the American political process became tethered to the business interests of a corporate cable television industry. She also serves as director for the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology at Purdue, and senior editor for the Made by History column at Time magazine. Now I'll hand things over to Dr. Brownell.
Hello, and thank you so much, Jake Purcell, for putting this event together, and to Sarah Weichsel for her leadership of the AHA at this really important political juncture for our profession, and for the AHA for having events like this that showcase the insights and rigor of our professional historians and the role that they can play in advancing public knowledge and discourse. So today we are in day 16 of a federal government shutdown. So a federal government shutdown happens when the appropriation process breaks down. So per the Constitution, the annual procedure to fund the government starts in the House of Representatives, which passes individual appropriation bills that go to the Senate and then are signed into law by the president. If any of these bills are not signed into law by the beginning of the next fiscal year, which starts October 1st, then the government agencies and operations without a law covering their operations shut down because they do not have the funding to pay employees and provide services. The exception is the passage of an interim continuing resolution that could be enacted to extend the deadline for as long as Congress determines. So over the past 40 years, government shutdowns have become more frequent and contentious. And our panel here today is going to help to explain why. After I introduce the panelists, I will begin a moderated conversation to help us understand the origin, stakes, and consequences of government shutdowns. First, we have Lily Geismer, a professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. Dr. Geismer's research and teaching focus on 20th century political and urban history in the United States, especially liberalism and the Democratic Party. She is the author of several books, but most recently Left Behind, the Democrats' failed attempt to solve inequality, which examines the Democratic Party during the Clinton era. Her work has appeared in the Journal of American History, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and Dissent. John Lawrence has both academic and practitioner credentials. He spent 38 years as a senior congressional staff member, the last 8 of which as chief of staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He also has a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and since 2013 has been a visiting professor at the University of California's Washington Center. He blogs on national politics and Congress at Domeocracy, D-O-M-E, and has written 2 books on modern congressional history. The Class of 74, Congress After Watergate, and the Roots of Partisanship, and Arc of Power, Inside Nancy Pelosi's Speakership, 2005 to 2010. Finally, we have Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair in Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Dr. Suri is the author and editor of 11 books on contemporary politics and foreign policy, most recently, Civil War by Other Means, America's long and unfinished fight for democracy. Dr. Suri writes for major newspapers and magazines, as well as for various online sites and blogs. So let's begin with the basics. First and foremost, why does our constitutional system allow for shutdowns? Are they a bug in the system or an actual check on concentrated power? Jeremi, do you want to begin?
Sure, and thank you, Kathy, for moderating us, and thank you to the AHA for putting this together, Sarah Wixel and Jake, and to my colleagues, John Lawrence and Lily Geismer, and Kathy for being here. It's really a delight to be part of this. So I think this is actually an essential part of our system, the system that allows for shutdowns when one party or one group seeks to accumulate too much power for themselves. Our system, our constitutional system, is in some ways designed not to work when anyone seeks to get too much done too fast with too much concentrated power. And so the system is such that even a minority, in this case, the Democratic Party in the Senate, can, through the filibuster, prevent the appropriations bills, the 12 appropriations bills, from going forward. That is not to give them a veto over government policy, but it is to require basic compromise and basic negotiation on the most important role the legislature has, which is regulating the power of the purse. We are not a parliamentary system where the government in power has inherent control over the legislative process. We are a system where the executive power is deeply divided from the legislative process, and then the legislative process is divided within itself. So this is not a bug in the system. This is actually how the system is designed. The bug in the system now are all of the incentives against compromise, all of the incentives that both parties have, but particularly the party in power, to appeal to its base, to do extreme things, and to avoid the necessary compromise that through the last 2 centuries plus has been essential to the acts of appropriations to keep our government running.
John, how does your experience behind the scenes in Congress perhaps add to this question?
Well, I would echo Jeremi's observation. This is not a breakdown of the system. This is, for better or worse, the system. And of course, within the Congress itself, the option for shutdowns, which occur on an annual basis because we have an annual budgeting and appropriations process, are looked upon as opportunities, particularly in the more modern age, as hyperpartisanship and close margins between the parties, and of course, frequent elections provide this battlefield on an annual basis. It's been many years, since the Congress actually passed 12 appropriation bills on time. So you're always dealing with a continuing resolution. And I was taught a long time ago that when the stagecoach goes through a narrow pass in the valley, that's when the attack occurs. And that's what happens with the appropriation bills. You have to pass them on an annual basis. They're called must-pass bills. And because they're consequential, because you know they're going to pass, that is the opportunity for the minority to insert issues into them. Now, it's interesting that Vice President Vance recently, at the outset of this shutdown, called it preposterous that Democrats would use the possibility of a shutdown as leverage to try to advance a policy goal. In this particular case, extension of support payments for subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. But of course, Congress always uses such opportunities as leverage. That's the nature of the political system, particularly for the minority. There are rare opportunities where they do have the opportunity, the chance to insert their will in and force the majority party, force the administration to give consideration, either successfully or not, to the issues that are of importance to the minority. And that's basically what we're seeing now. And we've seen an increasing frequency since the 1990s with this increase in partisanship and the more frequent movement of control between the parties, which was not nearly as common as we know prior to the 1990s.
Well, let's go back to the 1990s and the really high-profile budget battle that unfolded in 1995 between Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich facing off against President Bill Clinton. It resulted in a government shutdown for 5 days between November 14th and November 19th, and then again for 21 days from December 16th through January 6th. So, Lily, as an expert on the Clinton presidency, what do you see as the roots of the conflict when we kind of look through the lens of the Clinton presidency?
Sure. I actually want to say one thing to the question before, or just highlight one thing, which is how recent a phenomenon this is. I mean, I think that this question of like, so it's part of the system, but I do think the fact that like, I mean, it comes out of the Carter years of a new politicized system of attaching political issues to appropriation bills, and Carter asking his attorney general to look into this issue and think about how the fact that you wouldn't actually extend appropriations in the ways that had been done for a long time. So I do think it's like this question of like like the chicken and egg of this of like the increasing politicization of the process, but then driving this as a new technique that comes in. And I would say like so I'm answering your question I wasn't asked, but I'll go into it anyway. But I do think one thing that comes up that I like, the optimist in me, and this goes to sort of thinking about the system, is that it actually opens up a chance to understand how Congress works. Like I think there's so often it's such an opaque process, except to people like John. And to me, I mean, I still find this that I have to remind myself each time I go into to work on it, what happens. But I think it's actually a chance to sort of think about this and have a public conversation. So that's my the days I'm feeling the most optimistic about America and the United States and its system. You can see that this is how it sort of comes to work. But I will go back to the 1990s, which is really the moment that I mean, there'd been shorter shutdowns before that, but where it really becomes used. And this is a kind of I know this mostly from the Clinton side of spending like way more time than probably anyone should thinking about Bill Clinton, and how this kind of came to shape his presidency. But the roots come from this moment of it being 1995. You have the Republicans had gained control of Congress for the first time in 40 years. And this was seen as like a major defeat to the Clinton presidency. I mean, it was really seen as a referendum on Clinton, and there was lots of rumors of him being a one-term president. The issue itself, I mean, what had happened was Newt Gingrich had run on the idea of the contract with America, which was this sort of 10-point plan. Much of which had to do with limiting the size of government and reducing the federal budget. It's worth noting that was also an issue, and had come into office with a plan of really limiting spending spending for Medicare, turning Medicaid and welfare programs over to the states, and wanting Bill Clinton to sign this bill. One thing that's important is Clinton had actually agreed on the idea of balancing, also wanted to balance the budget. But basically what they were fighting over was what data to use to determine how that would happen and which programs could be cut, which should be reduced and which shouldn't. And so in some ways it was like a technocratic fight over kind of should you be using the numbers of OMB or the Congressional Budget Office, but it actually was a much larger fight about how big the federal government should be and how it should operate. And so that's what they kind of come into to fight about. And I think it's really worth thinking about. I was going to sort of talk about it I'll talk more about the perspective from the Clinton side of the conflict, but I mean, Clinton had run on the idea of reinventing government that had been kind of major to his plank of coming in 1992. He famously, they had Al Gore run this whole program called Reinventing Government, which was actually kind of part of their efforts to embrace more market-based and public-private approaches. And they said that they were going to make the government work better, cost less, and get results Americans care about. And they had gone through kind of bringing private sector approaches in. And so in many ways, it's actually like a precursor to DOGE, although done in a much more softer way, I would say, than DOGE did. It was a lot more like reviewing, looking over regulations. But that was an idea, was like that we were going to make government more efficient. So this is like kind of in the air in this particular moment. But I do think it's worth noting that Bill Clinton had an understanding that government did have an essential role to play and did provide essential services and should. And so part of what the kind of the gamble that his administration makes about the shutdown is that Americans might want government reinvented or might be frustrated with certain aspects of like big government, but they still wanted the services that government provided. And so that a shutdown would actually be a way to kind of force a conversation about that. And so that sort of becomes the roots of the conflict about this kind of these various different questions and debates. And then there's also questions about the kind of political strategy behind it too from both sides, but I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, what about the looking at it from the Republican congressional point of view? What's the root of the conflict from the lens of Gingrich kind of leading this newly elected majority in the House?
Well, I think that it's a very important question to ask, because I think when people look at the outcomes of that shutdown or any shutdown, they very often look and see whether or not the minority was able to force, although this is the Republicans were the new majority in the 90s, as Lily pointed out, whether they were able to win their objectives. And very often the shutdowns end with a whisper rather than a great victory. But I would argue that as important as the debate that Lily mentions between OMB scoring or CBO scoring is to think about how Gingrich viewed this. And I think that the key is for him is reestablishing Congress as a co-equal branch of government. That for most of the prior 70 years or close to 70 years, Democrats had a lock on one or both houses of Congress, and very often both of them. And as Congress now came into a historical period where power would shift back and forth much more frequently, Congress also began to reassert itself in a way. So to some extent, the whether or not specific objectives, which scoring mechanism you use, whether or not there was a repeal of the Clinton tax cuts of 1993 or not, was less important, I think, in some ways than Gingrich sending a message, which he had incidentally sent to his colleagues in the Congress, and that is the old parameters are gone. I'm going to start making new ones. We're going to end committees. We're going to change procedures on the floor. We are asserting a new role that has been denigrated by the executive and the imperial presidency over time. And we are a factor to be dealt with. We may not be a factor between now and the time the CR is signed, but coming out of this, of course, you do get a series of balanced budget amendments. You get compromises on major legislation like welfare reform. And I think that it serves to buoy the spirit of both Democrats and Republicans that sending a message to the executive branch that we're not to be taken for granted. We're not here to be your tool. We are a co-equal branch, and we're going to assert ourselves in that way. And I think in that sense, the 95 shutdown served its purpose. And I think to some extent, that's what you see going on right now with the Democrats and the shutdown is an effort to project power, send a message to the base that you're prepared to engage in a fight. That fight may not be immediately successful from a policy standpoint. From an institutional standpoint, it's an important fight to have.
Yeah. I would only add that I think in addition to reasserting congressional authority, this is, as Lily said, this is the first time the Republicans have really come back into power in Congress in a very, very long time. And Gingrich is indicating that he's going to fight politics in a different way. This is political warfare, actually. Congress had been a pretty clubby place. It's not that there weren't partisan differences. There certainly were, especially around civil rights and many other issues. But it was also a pretty clubby place. And it was a place that was built around a committee structure, seniority, and various other procedures that encouraged compromise across party lines. And Gingrich believed that those procedures disadvantaged the Republicans. And so as the new majority party in the House, trying to build, in his eyes, a long-term majority, they had to fight politics in a different way. And so this was no holds barred. This was an appeal to the extremes. This was an effort to polarize the country. Much of what we're seeing today from the Trump administration really begins with the Gingrich administration. I think a whole series of historians have actually really elucidated this very, very well, including Lily. And that really opens up a space in the media, as Kathy has written, for this to become a new discourse of politics where it's not about compromise, but it's about who can be more pure. And that is where this shutdown story does actually take us back earlier than the 70s. I just want to make reference as a historian to the 19th century, because that is the story of the decades after the Civil War. And I think that's relevant for today. It's why I wrote a bit about this, that the Civil War, not the war itself, but the partisanship after the war, is very much the model for what Gingrich is trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So what constitutes, and we've talked, so you've mentioned a variety of statements about how it ends, right? How it kind of just fizzles out sometimes. It doesn't end with a bang. But I'm wondering, what constitutes a win in this capacity? Is it just a partisan struggle to one up a partisan opponent? Or how does someone win, or how is victory defined in this confrontation, this shutdown battle? That's for anyone.
I think I'll start out quickly. I think it's about who gets to set the agenda going forward. I think we have to be honest. Everyone loses in these. The American public certainly loses. Right now, people are working without pay, and others are not working, and people are dealing with the uncertainty about what's going to happen in their lives. So everyone loses in that sense. Neither party looks good. No one comes out saying, yay, my party is an effective governing party as a consequence of this. But the question is, who sets the agenda going forward? So after 1995, Clinton won, it seems to me, because Clinton was in the position of saying, they closed the government, I'm the one who's keeping it open, and don't let them do this again. Remember his statement, don't ever shut down the government, right? And he uses that as a kind of bloody shirt over Gingrich, makes Gingrich look like he's basically irresponsible. And Clinton can move to the center and, in a sense, steal their agenda, but also be on the side of good governance, as he's also on the side of closing big government. And so that's I think what each side is looking for. In the last shutdown under President Trump, term number one, the Democrats won, it seemed to me, because Trump had put out his border wall as the main agenda item in the budget, and that was taken out. So I think the reason the Democrats are doing what they're doing now is because they believe the agenda has been stolen from them by Trump, either by pushing bills like the budget bill through the House with no compromise, without even showing it to Democrats, or just ignoring Congress as a whole. And they're trying to take the agenda back and say, no, now healthcare matters, and you're going to have to address healthcare costs one way or another. That's the debate they want to have. And if they win, that will be the debate we will have after the shutdown as well.
Yeah, also, I mean, I'll add on, I think that the question of, and with 95 in particular, the 95, 96 shutdowns, that, I mean, it's seen as Clinton winning. That, I mean, one thing, if you just do it by approval ratings, like his approval ratings had been low, I mean, they go up to the mid 50s and stay there for the rest of his presidency. He wins the 96 election in a landslide with this idea. I mean, one thing I think is really, I have used time and time again a statement that the era of big government is over. But I actually was like preparing for this, was thinking about that only came it was like a little bit more than 2 weeks after the shutdown ended. So thinking about it within that context, that it actually like in some ways gave him a mandate to make particular kinds of statements. And his next one is like, well, we shouldn't leave people, like we can't leave people out on their own. But that gets less remembered. And so I think it actually gave in some ways it sort of a mandate to his particular philosophy, and then going in around things like around welfare reform, other kinds of cuts to government. So that goes to the fact that like many people, especially many more marginalized people, lose out tremendously from this in this particular moment. I would say the other thing, I mean, I think that for Gingrich, and I know less about this, but I think it's a sign. I mean, it's a sign that his particular, like you can see him playing hardball politics. But I do think it's a moment where he loses some support amongst the base, and you have the you have him less than 3 years later, losing control of the speakership. So I think that, like, in some ways, it's actually this first moment where you see these fissures within the Republican Party starting to emerge, and so they brought in all these new members of Congress who didn't fully understand how Congress worked, and that actually opens up a kind of another new era for the Republican Party. As a coda, the other side thing of like where Clinton either wins or loses is the fact that, like, because of the shutdown that the Monica Lewinsky affair begins. And it's not to say that it maybe would have happened without that, but it's the fact that they were having interns play essential government roles because they had sent people home that actually leads that whole moment. And so I think that also leads to Republicans finding other strategies such that, like, that basically the fight moves to other spaces like investigations and impeachments as other kinds of approaches too. So I think those are questions of like the winning and losing, and then that setting particular kinds of agendas forward for politics in the next kind of 30 years after.
I think also there's a question here as to, which I think is related to what we've been talking about, that is who pays the consequence for a government shutdown. I would argue it rarely is the determining factor. They almost always occur in a non-election year, because having a shutdown in an election year is not a really good idea. The last time I know we did that, the Republicans shut down twice in 2018. And of course, in that case, they lost control of Congress, not simply for that reason, but it certainly didn't help in 2018. But in the 1990s and with the Republicans shutting down government under Obama, it didn't impact the congressional elections. The party that was in the majority and arguably could be blamed for not being able to manage government still ended up controlling Congress afterwards. And so I'm not sure it has that significant an impact as it does within the institution. And I think that what Lily's saying, that has a lot of importance. It can reset within the institution in a way that the average voter and many people in the press may not realize. I'll give you an example. In 2010, when we in the Democratic Party lost control of the Congress, I ran into John Boehner in the halls, and I said, "Well, we had worked together for years, and I said, congratulations, you'll be speaker now because you have this huge influx of people." And he said, "In 6 months, I'll be more popular in your caucus than I will be in my own," because they had become the majority with this huge influx of Tea Party people who, like Gingrich, vis-a-vis the Republican leadership he displaced, viewed the traditional leadership, the establishment leadership, as much of a problem as they did the Democrats. And that dynamic plays out again in 2015 when Boehner, having gone through a shutdown in 2013 that he didn't want, that he desperately wanted to avoid because he knew it was going to be unsuccessful, ends up alienating large numbers of these Tea Party people and is himself thrown out of the speakership in 2015. So there are dynamics that are unleashed in this process that are not always immediately evident to observers in or outside the Congress.
So let's dig in a little bit more to the nuts and bolts of what actually happens during a government shutdowns. What happens to workers and agencies when they're waiting? They're not getting paid and they're waiting to do what actually happens to the mechanisms of government during these shutdowns?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, those people who are not considered essential are told not to come in, and as a result, even though certain payments like foreign payments or Social Security, Medicare checks may go out, the actual offices that staff those programs do not, and so constituents are going to run into problems. Traditionally, of course, furloughed workers are paid once they are furloughed, although in this particular case, the president has determined that he'll reallocate money from the Defense Department to pay active duty military right now. But he's also suggesting that they may not pay people who are furloughed, and that would be contrary to a law that he signed in his first term as president. I think another thing that's really unique about this particular shutdown is that in some ways it allows the Trump administration to accelerate a sort of a slow-moving government shutdown that they've instigated on their own in terms of shutting down agencies, shutting down programs, firing civil service personnel and others. And so it's one of the reasons I think they may not feel a great deal of pressure. The president has said, I may fire large numbers of people. The director of Office of Management and Budget, Senator Lee of Utah, said this has been his pipe dream since he was in puberty, to have the opportunity to get rid of so many people. So I think there's a real opportunity for an administration that is thinking in terms of desizing government and has been doing so absent a shutdown, to continue to do so in this particular case at an accelerated basis, and may not have much of an incentive for, as most prior administrations have, for getting people back to work and getting the government functioning again.
Lily, you mentioned earlier about how the Clinton administration used the 95 shutdown as a way to actually reevaluate certain policies. Can you talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of what that actually looks like historically?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I think the other side of it is like, and this goes to the question of like what happens during a shutdown. I do think it actually becomes an exposure about like kind of what services government provides, and in a way that exposes certain kinds of things where you're not, the average American isn't aware of the role of the federal government. So things like the weather, I mean, that like getting a passport, all these like sort of basic things that happen that when you have another one I was thinking about, was this has come up time and time again about air traffic controllers, and that as the ways that they're fundamental disruptions that occur when a shutdown happens. So I think that like that was one thing that I remember as I was like a teenager or young teenager when the first shutdown happened. But I remember it being a big deal that the national parks were closed, and that like that. I mean, that you had this thing, and like that museums were closed, and all these kinds of things. And this was an idea like you don't. I mean, there's not always a one-to-one association about that being the federal government who runs those services, but I think it's actually a really important way of kind of like that was one of the things I think they were trying to show. And one of the things I think that's important, like issue is this has become far more normalized, I guess, unless you work for the federal government or you live in DC. Like I have to always remember when the last ones were. So it's become a different kind of thing than like as it's become more routine. But I do think it has become there's a way of sort of showing like these are things that happen when, that the government does. With Clinton, I mean, there were a couple of things that were going on. I mean, one is this issue around this idea of making government more efficient, and this idea that it become like this narrative about the government being like big and bloated, and so bringing in a program to kind of reevaluate and make it more consumer oriented was their idea that like we need to treat the citizens like customers, and so we want to bring in like sort of private sector approaches. And I think the ones with the Clinton administration were a little bit more of like I would say like a scalpel. I mean, it was like very slow. It was like sort of a slow efforts to get rid of certain kinds of programs that were seen as less efficient. But you can see it around basic things like reducing the number of people doing wage and hour enforcement. Those do actually affect people's lives in various different kinds of ways. That was like those are that's the kind of thing that was getting impacted. I think the other question that actually comes up here and also affects how Clinton was doing things was around the balancing of the budget. And that has to do with a way in which the administration had become far more one of the big reasons that they were invested in balancing the budget had to do with the fact that they wanted to encourage investment. And there was an idea that this big unbalanced budget was making was upsetting the bond market, and so people were not like buying bonds, and that's the famous idea that Robert Rubin had encouraged Clinton and Greenspan had to encourage Clinton to think in those ways. So this actually does bring new incentives to that kind of program. To those kinds of programs, and then Clinton does get balanced budgets. You have balanced budgets from 1998 to 2001. So that's another way that I think it affect like you have this kind of this effect, but that comes at cost of things like the institution of welfare reform, more things being devolved to the states, and some of those other kinds of things. So a compromise approach of the Clinton administration, coupled with kind of some of the things like Gingrich and the Republicans were advocating for.
Katie, can I put my labor history hat on for a second here? I mean, what's really interesting to me about this shutdown, and this has been a process, of course, as historians, we know nothing is really unique to any one moment. What we're seeing is, I think, a culmination of a process over the last 3 to 4 shutdowns, where more and more workers who work for the federal government are declared essential workers. which means they have to show up to work when they're not getting paid. And in prior shutdowns, there were fewer essential workers. So more of the government actually did shut down, which meant that fewer people were working without being paid while they were working. Now we have literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, from TSA workers, a bloated Homeland Security agency that didn't exist before, ICE. Think of how much ICE has grown. The military, they had enough money to give them their October 15th checks. They won't get their next check, I don't think. Air traffic controllers, we can go on and on and on. CDC, emergency workers, FEMA, what's left of FEMA workers, et cetera, who are all being brought into work and told they have to wait to get paid, and then threatened that they might not even get paid in some cases. And I think that says something about labor in American society, that we assume people will show up to work when they're not getting paid. And we assume they can go on living and feeding their children when they're not getting paid. This would be unthinkable in the late 19th century. If people weren't getting paid at work, they had to go somewhere else to get paid so that they could keep their families going. It is a kind of corporatization of the federal government, first of all, it seems to me. And second, it leaves us in a really interesting situation because we don't know when that will break. There will come some moment. I don't know if it's 1 month, 34, 35 days, the last longest shutdown. Is it 2 months? Is it Thanksgiving? Is there a moment at which people really stop showing up? What we saw in the last shutdown was that air traffic controllers started calling in sick in very large numbers. That hasn't really happened yet, but when will it happen? What does that look like? It seems to me we can go on a long time without paying people, but we can't go on forever. And it's a loaded analogy, but I remember on a number of trips I made to Russia, when you still could go to Russia and do research in Russia, one of the challenges they had is people weren't being paid in government. And so all of a sudden you'd show up at the archives and no one was there to let you in, right? And that had a huge effect, actually, on the way Russians started to see their government. And I think had a hugely negative effect upon democracy in that democratizing moment. We are not Russia, obviously. But we have to think about the implications of that, not just for labor, but for the ways in which democracy manages labor.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings up a really interesting question about public opinion and the different ways that public opinion is crafted. We can look at public approval numbers of a president, but those are different parameters by which you can study public views and satisfaction and sentiment about government. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more broadly about what is the role that public opinion plays. How are government officials who are engaging in this political negotiation and debate, how are they thinking about public opinion? What are they perhaps not thinking about? And how are they working these narratives about quote unquote blame?
Well, you can see that both sides are fashioning narratives and messages to have specific appeal to the electorate. Democrats uncharacteristically have been disciplined in this case and have focused on one specific issue, and that being the retention of of payment supports for the insurance premiums, and are saying, look, this is what we're doing. They know that over 70% of the American people support that. They know that the impact of losing those support payments is going to disproportionately impact people in Republican states. And so they think that to the extent to which they can make this case around the need for extending those support payments to prevent premiums from going up in November, whether they win that fight now or whether they win that fight after the end of the shutdown occurs, they're going to be able to say it's because we took on that fight and we delivered for the American people. From the Republican standpoint, obviously they're saying, look, you have the unanimous Republican support for the short-term extension, the CR. There's no reason that this should be shut down except for the fact that the Democrats are demanding us to make major concessions. The polling that I've seen has been relatively close. I'm not sure that you can get many polls these days that are going to show you radical differences in terms of which party do you blame. Loyalism seems to affect most polling outcomes. I think what's salient here is the Democrats have strong support around the issue that they are basing their refusal to support this Republican written CR on. That assumes that people make that connection. And whenever we assume that people are going to make connections between Democrats and healthcare, I think all of us who have been in this fight or in the past, remember the signs during the Affordable Care Act, which is keep the government out of my Medicare, and think, boy, we still have a lot of educating to do. So I think that this is, if your question is, at what point do people get worried on Capitol Hill and say the public is angry, we've got to make these concessions and finish this up? That's going to happen. People know that as you get closer to the holidays, as the stories become personalized, you see individuals who are having to choose between, putting food on the table and putting gas in the tank. It's going to become a more personalized issue and less of an institutional issue. And at that point, I suspect the pressure will grow on, particularly on Democrats, to find a way to end the shutdown and claim victory if they extend the health premium supports, which both sides have said they intend to do, albeit not necessarily on exactly the same terms.
I think November 1st is an interesting date, right? Because as I understand it, that's when many people will receive information, both with regard to the Affordable Care Act, those whose insurance comes to the ACA, and also with regard to Medicare about increased premiums. And so my guess is that, I have no inside knowledge on this, but my guess is that the Democratic leadership is looking to that date to be a date that raises consciousness for people in a very personal way about what the status quo, if we had a continuing resolution, would mean for their insurance costs. And I think the way to then frame that after November 1st, which I would expect, and I'm already starting to do this, as John said, right, is to say that what we are arguing for is to do something so you don't get those bills that you will get otherwise that will double and triple your healthcare costs. So in that sense, it seems to me the time is on the Democrat side. It has been a little surprising to me for that reason that Trump hasn't tried to offer a deal which gives 10% of what Democrats want, but makes it look like this would be the classic Trump thing, to make it look like he's trying to address this issue but not address it. I've actually been quite surprised that he hasn't done that.
So one of the interesting things that has come up in a variety of these comments is this notion of shutdowns becoming more normalized over the last 4 decades. So why? And why are shutdowns more common when Republicans are in the majority of one or both chambers of Congress? Anyone can take that, or everyone can add their thoughts.
I mean, I'll just give a very obvious answer. I think the more partisan we are, obviously, the harder it is to compromise, the harder it is to go through the appropriations process. John would know the answer to this. I think it has been years upon years since we've had anything like a real budgeting process where we've actually had what used to be the normal, right? Which is where you have kind of the last time I can think of is President George H.W. Bush, right? Where you have the parties sitting down together and coming to a compromise. That's the famous moment when Bush agrees to some tax increases for some of the other things he wants. And for obvious reasons, Republicans after that will never want to do that. So I don't want to blame the Republicans alone. I want to say it's a partisan issue, but particularly for a party, the Republican Party, that has set itself from Gingrich forward, as we talked about before, against the notion of compromising with big government and tax increases in a government where you need more revenue and you need more services. This has become a kind of default position for them to go back to.
Yeah, I agree. I just think oh, I'm sorry, Lily.
You go for it. You go.
I was going to say, I mean, the point Jeremy makes is a very accurate one. These are more common with Republicans. Republicans, I think, have been successful in the messaging sense in utilizing shutdowns as a way of making the point that government is too big, it's too expensive, that we should find ways of paring it back. And they also have less investment in many of the programs. You can see the president right now going around and cutting programs that he says are democratic programs, or impounding money for infrastructure projects in specific states. Whereas I think Democrats are generally consider themselves and are considered more the party of government. They need government to impose both the policies, pay for the policies, impose the regulatory and enforcement actions. And so they have a more institutional interest in in defending government and maintaining government. So Democrats, I think, are disinclined to utilize what power they have when they're in the minority for these kinds of shutdowns. In this particular case, I don't really think they had much choice because there's such a paucity of support among Democratic activists for the party and for the party leadership that I think they needed to see signs of life. And even if there's not a clear victory on the other side of the shutdown, at least they've seen their people fighting for something and fighting for something that in all likelihood they will be able to claim they won. They may not get the duration of the extension of the healthcare subsidies, or they may not get the restriction on presidential impoundment they're talking about, but they're going to get something. And because the Republicans want it also. And I think that is for their own internal political reasons, that's going to make this a shutdown that delivered for Democrats in a way sometimes shutdowns have not in the past.
Yeah, I think that raises an important point to go back to the earlier question about public opinion. But I think that this idea of like, are you trying to win over all public opinion or like your own party and base? And I do think this issue of like the feeling that Democrats base feeling so disillusioned, like this dealing with a crisis of disillusionment is a real one. And so this as a moment for doing it for these other kinds of symbolic purposes. And that goes back to our original point of like what shutdowns do are often not sometimes are the thing that they're set out to do, but often have these for other kinds of gains. I think the point about this is a kind of coming out of a style of just increasing lack of compromise that I do think Gingrich began, and so that we sort of see this as a moment moving forward. But I do think it's important, like it often is used symbolically as like a symbol of gridlock. But actually, one thing I'm always struck by is like the 90s had much less gridlock than there is like going forward. I mean, there's actually like a tremendous amount of bipartisan bills that get passed throughout into the 90s and into the early 2000s, and like the sort of what has happened subsequently. So I think it symbolically has that meaning based on sort of what's actually actually happening. And another thing I'll say is like the last time the Democrats did this was over the border wall. And I think that's actually a really important one to sort of show that like it's not what big government means. I mean, the ways in which like sort of there's still these moments of actually standing against certain kinds of government spending. And so it does go to this idea that Democrats stand for government, but government spent on particular kinds of things and in particular kind of issues.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up the question that under Clinton and Obama, you have the shutdowns that happen under divided government, which means that at least one chamber, if not both, in Congress was controlled by the other party. So it seems like more of this partisan gridlock. But now the GOP has a control of both Congress and the White House. How does that factor into the contemporary dynamics and how it might be similar or different from previous instances?
Well, what you have here clearly is it is somewhat unique in that sense, and because it heightens the fact that it's the ability of the minority in the Senate to force this fight, which the Republicans are happy to make that accusation that the Republicans are in agreement. It's only because we need 7 or so Democrats to join us. That's, of course, as we all know, that's a restriction that's imposed by themselves, not by the Constitution. It's the filibuster in Rule 22 that creates that power and that leverage on the part of the minority. They could change that. They're not going to, I don't think, because that serves the purposes of individual senators and the Senate as an institution so well. But I do think that when you have unified government in the way you have now, what's significant in particular is how cowed the majority is by the executive branch and the unwillingness, I think, of the Republicans in the Congress to move beyond where Trump is. And I don't think you've had that kind of domination by the executive branch of the congressional majority in the past. So even though they have the ability to negotiate, and in the past we would always have negotiations going on behind closed doors. It was never quite as frozen as public impression might have been. Here you have a president who's, whether he's been distracted by the Middle East or he's happy to run this unilateral executive where he's closing government and changing the face of government without the imposition of the Congress's will. I think that to some extent inhibits the congressional Republican leadership from doing what they might otherwise do under the normal way in which shutdowns are handled.
I think curiously, the fact that it's a minority in the Senate that's the key constituency here, and a Senate that's filled with a number of Republicans who probably agree more with the Democratic position than their own. I'm thinking here of Susan Collins, also facing a major electoral challenge now in Maine, and others. I think makes the off ramp here a little different, right? And I have to give credit to John. This is something John said on our podcast when we talked about this a few days ago, right? I think what's unique about this is that the negotiations in the Senate, not negotiations between the House and the president. That's normally the way we think about it, right? We think about the days of Pelosi and Trump, but this, or Boehner and Obama, right? But this is actually going to be within the Senate that you're likely to see a bill come forward that will fund the government and will do part of what the Democrats are asking for with regard to healthcare. If such a bill were to pass the Senate, it's very hard to imagine the House and the president resisting that consistently, because that would put a lot of pressure on them. They might try, but then you would actually have a bill to open the government. And then you would have Mike Johnson and Donald Trump saying, no, we're still not going to open the government, even when our own Republicans in the Senate have voted for this. So that's a kind of unique element. As I think back to past shutdowns, the Senate was usually the less important of the three players between the House, Senate, and the White House. Now the Senate might turn out to be the most important player. And in a sense, the relationship between Thune and Schumer might turn out to be the most important part in this story.
And even just in the last few days, there have been these rumors now circulating that Thune, I think, even said something in the last 24 hours or so that, well, there are some things that we can see that we might be able to do on this health. The challenge is going to be, are they going to do it in the context of a continuing resolution, or is there going to have to be, as the president has insisted, a resolution of the continuing resolution issue, and then subsequently the healthcare bill that would come forward separately? That's a tough sell with Democrats believing that the Republicans will follow through, or that Trump would even sign that bill. So there may be more agreement gelling here around the policy, and I suspect there is. I think you'll get a shorter extension of the healthcare support payments, but then they've got to sell it to the president and to the House, and that may be a little more difficult. But what's interesting is Thune came out under pressure from people like, I'm sure, Susan Collins and several others, including Josh Hawley, that saying, we need this in our states, and we're going to have to move forward on this kind of compromise, which is, of course, I think overall good news for the Democrats, as long as they can make that stick either within the CR as a separate piece of legislation.
All right, we have, go ahead, Lily.
I was going to say one thing really quickly, which is just to go back to something that John had brought up earlier. I mean, I totally agree with, and they know the nuances of the Congress and Senate right now better than I do. But I was going to say something that John brought up that I think is really important about the differences of this moment, which is that it's coming on the heels of this, that we've watched like a 9-month attack on the federal government. I mean, and I think that is a fundamental difference. I mean, even though that has happened in incremental ways at other points, that this has been such a public component of sort of this crisis of government, actually. And I think that there's long-term both policy and also sort of like just kind of larger political kind of implications about that. And so I think there's a question like the short term for the Democrats about what this means, winning this particular fight. But I do think there's a much bigger conversation about like the actual place of government in American society, like in American society, and like what it means to have an expansive government, and thinking about not just in reactive ways, but proactive ways, as there's going to have to be either a rethinking or remaking of government, in the next several years. So that to me is like the implications of where this kind of where we're going to move going forward on those questions.
Great. Thank you so much. We are wrapping up here, but we've got about 2 minutes left. So in 2 minutes, I'm wondering if each of you might take, 30 to 40 seconds to really highlight what your one key historical takeaway. Looking at this as a historian, what's the one thing that you think audiences here today should really be grappling with as they're thinking about this current issue from a historical perspective? Lily, do you want to start first?
No.
Okay.
I talked last before.
All right,
go
ahead.
I'll go. I think it's where we started with your excellent question at the start, Kathy. Our system is built to have many roadblocks and checks upon the concentration of power. And government shutdowns are one of those roadblocks. They're a particularly ugly one, but they are one of those. And the more we see any party or any person trying to concentrate power, the more incentive there will be for the other side to shut down the government in this way, even to shut it down so he can't cut it in some ways.
Great. And you kept within 40 seconds. Well done. John?
I would just say that so long as we have the perpetuation of the conditions that create the fertile ground for these kinds of shutdowns, hyperpartisanship, close margins, an election upcoming in just a few months, in effect, that could determine not only who's in control, but a vastly different agenda. There's a disincentive for finding common ground, and there's a great deal of incentive for bringing out your base and generating enthusiasm around key issues. So I'm not hugely enthusiastic that, however this turns out, this is the last shutdown that we'll see.
All right, Lily, you want to take it home?
Okay, now I know I just really wanted the last word. That's why I said that I would go last. No, I'm just kidding. I think that, I mean, one is that these are often more symbolically important than actually important, and to sort of think about what actual impact they have. But I will say the other side of it, but they have huge symbolic meaning for both political and policy reasons. But I also think they're a real reminder for anyone who studies American history that government really matters, and it matters in a number of different scales and registers, and that's the thing. And it opens up actually from a question of studying it, a way to think about what government does and how it works.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all to all the panelists for spending the time to share their insights and expertise. And I'm going to turn it back over to our AHA Executive Director. Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, thank you all for a truly excellent discussion. Definitely learned so very much. This, unfortunately, concludes History Behind the Headlines, Government Shutdowns and the Federal Budget. We hope this event helped provide historical context for the issues that were discussed today. If you're not a member of the AHA yet, we hope you'll consider joining to support our programs like this one. A recording of today's events will be emailed to you when it's available. Questions or feedback can be sent to ahaonline@historians.org, and that is going to be posted in the chat. Finally, I just want to say thank you so much to Katie, to Lily, to John, to Jeremi for sharing their expertise with us and for giving so generously of their time today. We also want to thank all of our attendees for spending this hour with us. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch.